Hey guys, it is Thursday, April 18th. It is exactly 3 days after the Boston Marathon for 2019. So for this video, I just want to cover race day, how the race went. And if you did follow my race performance or look it up, you know that I didn't meet my time goal. The race was a little disappointing. But honestly, in retrospect, I wasn't sure the training was going to be there. You've probably seen some of my training videos and training logs. I missed a lot of workouts. I was going through a lot of stuff in my personal life, and I just wasn't really there for training. I wasn't mentally there. I wasn't prioritizing it. So I was kind of hoping to skate by on just getting in the volume and a couple big workouts, but that obviously wasn't enough, and I still think part of the reason, well, I'll go into reasons why I think the race didn't go that well at the end of the video, so I'll start by just telling you how race day went. So let's jump right into it, and I'll start with my 5:30 a.m. wake-up call. So first I want to let you know that I was in wave one, which means, when I had to get up, when I had to get on the buses, and when I started my race is going to be different than if you're in a later wave. I was scheduled for a 10:02 a.m. start. According to the race instructions, I needed to get on the buses between 6 a.m. and 6:45 a.m. in Boston Commons by the finish line, and then they would take us all the way to the starting line in Hopkins for that 10 a.m. start. So I was staying 3 or 4 miles away from the finish line in just an Airbnb down in Dorchester. So I had to wake up around, I think I woke up at 5:30 in the morning on race day to, get dressed, pack my bag, pack my food, and get a lift up to Boston Commons where I needed to catch the buses. So I had laid out everything the night before. I had laid out all the clothes I was taking, the food I was taking. Bag check is only at the finish line in the morning. So before you get on the buses, you have to drop your bag off at these rows of buses. And then the only thing you can take with you on the bus to Hopkins is it was about like a 1-gallon clear plastic bag of like food and water. So there was no bag check in Hopkins. Anything you took with you to the start, you either had to throw away or run the race with. So I had packed my bag to check for the finish, which had some food and some fluids and hydration, and a set of dry clothes. So I was planning to kind of eat and drink on the bus on the way to the starting line. And you go drop your bag off there. So I did that and then walked right over to Boston Commons to get on the buses. So everything is within about 2 blocks or so. The buses are lined up in Boston Commons. There were porta potties over in Boston Commons too, along where the buses lined up. I know it looked nice during the race, but when we woke up in the morning, there was a torrential downpour, there was lightning, there was thunder, it was windy, so you could see sheets of rain blowing. So in my head, I'm thinking this looks exactly like the weather from last year. Everything is drenched. I didn't feel that cold though, like it was in the 50s, I think, maybe high 40s, but it felt humid. It didn't feel that cold. So I had a poncho on to try to stay dry. I ended up wearing a pair of old trainers that were due to be thrown out, and I had my racing flats with me under my poncho. So I figured my feet would be getting wet, my socks and my shoes would be getting wet, and I didn't want to start the race like that. So I had my racing flats and my socks under the poncho with me I was going to put on right before the start. So I had shoes on, I didn't care they were getting wet, I had the poncho on, so I was staying mostly dry, and I had my little bag of food and water to take on the bus with me. We hopped on the buses, and this bus ride to Hopkins took, I feel like it must have taken over an hour, at least an hour, to get to Hopkins. So I was eating and drinking on the bus. I kind of tried to nap for a little while, but it was really uncomfortable. I was actually sitting over the tire, so my legs were like up on the tire, and my ankle was getting stiff, and like wasn't very comfortable. And that's a long time to sit on a bus right before a race. So I ate and drank what I thought was kind of a necessary amount, a few hundred calories. I drank about a water bottle and a half, but it wasn't water. I had that goo octane powder that I said I would be taking. So we got to the starting line in Hopkins. We got to Athletes Village around somewhere between 8 and 8:30. I'm not sure exactly when it was. So it was still raining, but raining a lot less heavy now. So everybody was filing off the buses into Athletes Village, and Athletes Village is just a yard. It's just, this grassy area behind a school. So it had been downpouring for a few hours, so everything was muddy, sopping wet, puddles. So they had some tents up, some like big white, event tents, but they must not have put these tents up until after it had been raining for a while because outside the tent was, muddy, sloshy, like inches of mud sucking people's shoes off, but the ground inside the tent was sopping wet too. So they must have just put the tents up recently. So people were kind of milling about in the tents to stay out of the rain, but like there's nothing to sit on, right? You stand or you sit on the ground. So a lot of people had plastic bags or they were sitting on their ponchos and things like that. So I took my poncho off and laid it on the ground and just sat on that. And they also had like bananas and coffee and a couple other things. They had some gels and stuff in Athletes Village, so you could have a little coffee, have something to eat or drink if you wanted. They had more porta potties in the Athletes Village. So really, we just sat on the ground on our ponchos in Athletes Village for another hour or so. So the start time for Wave 1, like I said, was just after 10 a.m. So they said corrals 1 through 6, like the first few corrals of Wave 1 would be called to the starting line around 9:15 to 9:30. So the starting line was about 3/4 of a mile walk from Athletes Village. They didn't actually call out the corrals in any way that I heard or saw. I just knew what time I was supposed to go. So I saw when it got to like 9:20 on my watch, I was like, I better start heading that way. And like there was some stirring in the tent and some people were getting up and heading out, but there wasn't really like a big announcement like, hey, head to the starting line, corrals, 1, 2, and 3. Maybe it was, it was kind of, Athletes Village is kind of spread across 2 fields, and the other field was closer to the start. Maybe they announced it over there. I was in the first field, like right when you get off the buses. Maybe they called it further over there and I just didn't hear it. So they also have a huge truck where you can dump any layers that you've been wearing that you don't want to race in, and they'll wash and donate all of those clothes. So they just had a huge truck on your way out of Athletes Village. They had volunteers with bags taking clothing donations and shoe donations. They had more of those right at the starting line too. And the walk to the start is just along this little residential street, and a couple people who live on that street are out in their yards or have a little tent up, to kind of watch people go by and watch the race start. And there was one tent that had, like sticks and jars of Vaseline, so you could get some Vaseline if you needed some last minute. Another one had, gels. Another one had cups of water. So that was really nice, just having those people there last minute, if you needed anything else. So when you get to the starting line, you kind of go down the street, and then the starting line is like all along the side street to the right, and then there's porta potties, water, and more clothing donation to the left. So I had been told that these porta potties at the starting line never really had much of a line, and that was a lie. These were the longest porta potty lines I had seen all morning. So the bus pickup in Boston Commons, no line for the bathrooms. The porta potties when you first enter Athletes Village, like not really, like maybe one person in line. These porta potties at the starting line had like 15 people to 20 people in line. And by the time you get there, you're maybe 15, 20 minutes out from the start of your wave. That was the longest I had to wait to use the bathroom all morning. So I didn't really warm up or do drills. I was, waiting in line to use the bathroom. And then I quick had to throw off all my layers, change my shoes, and go because I got out of the porta potty at like 9:58 and I didn't want to miss my starting wave, and I would have liked to see the elite men go off at 10, but I didn't get there in time. So by the time I got to the starting line at like maybe 10:04, they had it organized by corral, so I got in for corral 5 where I was. There's so many people, it's such a slow start. You're walking up to the start line for a few minutes after your wave starts, and then you kind of start a slow jog across the start line, but you're just packed in with, I think they said there were like 7,000 people in Wave 1. So it was kind of just like a slow jog for the first half mile of the race. It was just too crowded to go anywhere. We were definitely going slower than 7-minute pace at the beginning. And there just, there wasn't anywhere to go. Everybody was packed in. There were guys walking off the course to pee in the woods because they didn't have a chance to go at the porta potties because they didn't want to wait in line, I guess. Even though in Athletes Village and at the starting line, they have a separate like urinal men's only section where like obviously the line would be shorter and go faster. So the first mile was really slow, really crowded. You're just kind of jogging. You're not really racing yet. And it was a little bit anticlimactic. So I just, the first like mile of the race was just really a jog, and then it thinned out a little bit to pick up the pace a little bit to like 6:40, something like that. I kind of knew I was in trouble from the first few miles of the race. Just didn't feel that good. My legs didn't feel very good. It's almost like they had a little bit of soreness and fatigue. So I hadn't run too much the days before, just like 3 or 4 easy miles Saturday and Sunday. But I was on my feet and walking around a lot more than I should have and a lot more than I wanted to. And I also hadn't been hydrating as much as I should have, mostly because when you're out all day, you're kind of being a tourist, you're in a new city, you're traveling around, you just don't drink as much, and you just don't, it's harder to find bathrooms, you just don't think about it, and you don't hydrate as much as you should. And in my mind, I was preparing for cold weather, and I wasn't really thinking about needing to be hydrated. As soon as the race started, those first few miles, like I realized my legs didn't feel as fresh and springy as they should. So I was a little bit worried about, hitting time goals and having a good race right from the start, just because it didn't feel right. So it was still pretty crowded the first even 10K. Like you have the full road, but there are just thousands of runners. There's always somebody around you. And it's very hard to get over to aid stations if you're not already on the outside of the road, because there's probably 10 people across and you need to work your way through everybody, like merging through traffic if you want to get a drink at the aid stations. So, I don't think I took much to drink. I think maybe only 2 drinks during the first half of the race. So when I came through the halfway point, I came through the half marathon in 1:29, which was okay. That's around 6:50 pace, and obviously, technically a 3-hour marathon is in reach if you do your half in 1:29. But on Boston specifically, the second half of the course is harder than the first half, and as the day goes on, it's getting hotter, it's getting more humid, you're getting more dehydrated. When I came through the halfway point, I hadn't been feeling good for a while already, and it was too early to feel that bad. And I knew, even if I kept up my effort level, I didn't think, 3 hours seemed iffy. I was already kind of getting a headache, getting a little lightheaded. I felt like I was dehydrated, which I was surprised by since I drank so much in the morning. I actually drank so much, even though I used the restroom right before the race started, I had to use the restroom again, like since the race started, from drinking so much water. So I ended up stopping at mile 14 to use the restroom because I had to go pretty much since the race started. I don't want to say I had kind of thrown in the towel, but I kind of was figuring 3 hours was out of reach, and I still had another half marathon. I still had another 13 miles to go, and I didn't want to be even more uncomfortable the whole time. So I stopped at mile 14. At that aid station, there were some restrooms, some porta potties, so I, just stopped there and went. And then when I came out, my legs had almost they were like, oh, we stopped running, and they kind of felt even more fatigued, which you would kind of expect if you're running like a longer, harder effort, like a half marathon or marathon. You take a break, and then you try to start again. Your legs just don't have the same turnover. So stopping at mile 14, use the restroom, even though it was a necessity, definitely hurt my performance in the second half too, because my legs were so fatigued. So even from mile 14 on, like my paces had started to slow. I was still kind of lightheaded. I figured I was dehydrated. I was trying to get a drink at every aid station. And, I was getting slower and slower. I knew 3 hours was out the window now. And I just kind of wanted to finish the race. So the second half of the race was pretty much a death march. It was not fun. It hurt. I didn't feel good. I had a headache the whole time. My legs felt dead. And the second half is harder, and you have more hills, more uphill, more downhill. And I honestly don't remember that, like, all the way to like mile 19, 20 was kind of a blur. Like, there were people, there were crowds, they were cheering, but I was just kind of like trudging along. And I didn't even recognize Heartbreak Hill. I'm not sure. I'd have to look up exactly where it is, because I think it was described as like, a mile and a half of elevation gain. But when you're actually on the road, there's so much variability in like the steepness, and maybe it'll level off and then it'll go up a little bit and level off. You don't feel like you're climbing for a mile and a half straight, especially with some of the other rolling hills on the course, like before and after Heartbreak. I didn't know when I was on Heartbreak Hill at all. It was really only the last like mile or so of the course where you're back in Boston, the crowds are thicker, there's more people there, there's more cheering, you can see all the buildings of downtown. That's definitely the coolest part of the race, is the last mile. And I wish I would have had more of a kick, but my legs were so toast. It looked more like a quick jog to the finish than a very strong looking finish. At that point, it was just important to me to finish the race. So I came through, I think, at 3:15 or so, which was pretty far off my time goal of being close to 3, in a huge positive split. Like the first half of the race, roughly 1:30, the second half, roughly 1:45, which is pretty a pretty big difference. Um, but after talking to a lot of other runners after this race, a lot of people that struggled with the humidity, a lot of people that missed their time goal by even half an hour, just because they were feeling so rough. Even one of my friends who's a very, very fast runner who went off with the elite women, she ended up dropping out due to dehydration. So I think the weather was honestly much better than it was last year, but I think a lot of people were thrown off because of the weather forecast for rain and cold and things like that. And preparing for that and maybe fueling and hydrating like it's going to be cold and wet, and then getting hit with heat and humidity, I think a lot of people ended up dehydrated because they weren't expecting that kind of weather and they weren't preparing for it either physically or mentally. And that definitely happened to me too. I think there are a lot of little things that I could have done differently to try to be better prepared for this race. Sorry for the change of scenery. I had to go to a couple meetings. It's a couple hours later, and I wanted to kind of wrap things up by just letting you know what I would do differently next time, the things that I think harmed my performance and made me fall short of reaching my goal for Boston this year. There's a few big things, a few little things. I think one of the main things, I think you can kind of divide these things into kind of like short-term things and long-term things. So short-term things I could have done differently to, I think, improve my race performance would be staying off my feet more the days before the race, not walking and standing so much. It's hard with these destination races because you are traveling to a new place and you want to see things, you want to walk around the expo, you want to walk around the city. You know, you're usually out all day, you don't want to just sit in a hotel room or something like that. But we were out pretty much all day Saturday and Sunday. I was on my feet a lot more than I think I should have been, and I think that is some of the fatigue I felt in my legs on race day. Something similar to that, I think, that affected me was hydration. So I noticed I was drinking a lot less and going to the restroom a lot less the weekend that I was in Boston. And I think that's, again, because I was out all day and I just, wasn't sitting at a desk with water in front of me or sitting at home with water in front of me. And I think I was drinking probably about half as much as I would have compared to kind of a normal day. So I think I started the race dehydrated. I tried to drink a lot of fluid the morning of the race, but by that point I think it was too late. You really need to hydrate the few days before the race to get the water into your system and let it absorb. Something kind of broadly relevant to these destination races, similar to the two things I just said, is, your eating habits are different, your sleeping habits are different. So I wasn't sleeping very well the few nights before the race in Boston. It was a new bed, it was a different climate, a different environment. I was waking up sweaty a couple times, like with a sheet I was too cold, with the quilt I was too warm. So I know that sounds kind of picky, and maybe like I'm a very picky sleeper, but it's true that I just didn't sleep that well before the race, and it wasn't necessarily that I was nervous or excited. It's just the environment, sleeping conditions weren't what I was used to. And I think part of that also is the humidity I wasn't used to, and it resulted in me not really sleeping well the few nights before the race. Also, when you're traveling, obviously your diet's going to be a little bit different. The times of day you eat and what you eat are probably going to be a little bit different, although I don't think that played as big of a role in my performance in race day, because I ate pretty familiar foods like pastas and pizzas and things like that, and eggs and potatoes for breakfast. So I don't think that played as much of a role. One of the bigger long-term things, I think, was my training block. So, if you've watched my other training videos, my training didn't go the way I would have preferred. I didn't feel very prepared for this race. A lot of the volume was there from my training plan, but I missed a lot of workouts. I missed a lot of big workouts, hard workouts, a lot of workouts kind of in that middle of the training block that are crucial to kind of building up the race-specific fitness that you need for a marathon. Even if I was hydrated, even if I was rested, I obviously would have been closer to 3 hours, but I don't think I would have run as well as I did in my first marathon. So those are kind of the things that I think affected my race performance. I think part of it was mental too, the mental preparation, the expectations I had going into the race. You have to kind of be in the right mental space to run a good race, and I don't really think I was there. And that's also a product of all the time leading up to the race and the training block and everything like that too. So would I do Boston again? I think I would, but I don't think I would do it for a time goal. I think I would do Boston again if I decided I wanted to do it kind of for fun and just enjoy the experience. At least from my point of view, it was hard to have a successful competitive race in this kind of environment where, the race start, the process, the time delay, everything's much different than a typical race and probably much different than anything you would do during training. And even just all the people on the course, all the other racers, there are so many people around you all the time. And I'm not really used to that. Most of the races I do, you kind of thin out after the start and you have some space and you can get where you need to go in terms of like taking corners or getting aid from stations. And that's not really the case with Boston. There were always dozens of people around you. So if you needed to get over to an aid station, you couldn't just run over there. You had to navigate through a crowd. You had to kind of slow down, go around people, try not to trip people. If you're going to aid stations every mile or two, that's going to have a significant impact on your race. But that's just my personal experience and kind of my personal thoughts on it. I know a lot of people set PRs at Boston. A lot of people get a lot of energy from the crowds and the support, and they run great races there. So I guess the answer is I might do Boston again, but I think I would do it kind of for fun and just kind of enjoy it and try to run with friends and, high five the spectators and just enjoy the sights and things like that. So that was my race recap for the Boston Marathon 2019. Please let me know if you have any questions down in the comments about the race itself or about my experience of the race, logistics, anything like that. And I will see you guys soon.